Well, hello everyone, welcome back. And as you can see today, we're going to talk about constitutional nationalism. And in many ways, this Irish revolution we're going to talk about can be seen as a kind of internal revolution within Irish nationalism, with the overthrowing of the dominant constitutional party in the shape of the Home Rule movement and the Irish Parliamentary Party by this new force, Sinn Féin, and its various attendant military organisations, the Irish Volunteers, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, and to move Irish nationalism, as it were, in a more kind of separatist direction. So I think that's certainly one way you can characterise this revolution. It's an internal kind of revolution, and a demand for much more separatism, for almost full independence, rather than what the Home Rule movement will be focusing on. And I think what that hints at is something I'd just like to say by way of introduction, which is a very important point, which is about the nature of Irish nationalism. Now, Irish nationalism itself is really made up of two different strands. Both of them have their own tradition, both of them have their own history, both of them have their own claims, as it were, to legitimacy. But they're two types of Irish nationalism which tend to have a very uneasy relationship and usually a kind of antipathy. And there are two strands, and we're going to talk about these separately. I say we're going to talk about the constitutional side. And when we talk about the constitutional nationalism, essentially what we mean is peaceful, moderate, political, democratic types of nationalism, which would be the Home Rule tradition. These are politicians, really. These are people who want to stand in elections, certainly have peaceful protests, create mass movements and so on, but non-violent, essentially. So that's one strand. And you can take that strand of Irish nationalism way back. You look at its great forebears, as it were, its tradition. You look at someone like Daniel O'Connell, back in the pre-famine period. You look, of course, at Parnell. You look at, the Home Rule Party, John Redmond, and so on. So it has its tradition. It has its place, as it were, in at the centre of Irish nationalism. And of course, you can also take it forward into the recent Troubles. And it's one of the most remarkable things. If you look, for example, at nationalist politics in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, what have you got? Essentially, you've got a political side of the movement, a constitutional side of the movement in the shape of the SDLP, with a very, antipathetic kind of relationship with the IRA, Sinn Féin, and so on. Very uneasy relationship, and so I say that is a strand definitely that runs through. The other side of this, of course, which we're going to talk about later on in another lecture, is the physical force side, so-called. These are people, militarists, who believe in violence. Pure and simple. They accept the principle that how you're going to win Irish freedom is through violence. Now, and again, they've got their tradition. They can look back to insurrections of the past. They look back to Wolfe Tone in 1798. Robert Emmet in 1803, launching their own risings. The Young Irelanders of 1848. On and on, the Fenians, we'll talk about some of these as we go forward. So they have their own lineage, as it were. And the thing about Irish nationalism is when it's most successful is when these two sides come together and work together. And you see this, for example, under Parnell, when he manages to forge what he calls the New Departure, which essentially is a link between, the constitutionalism, the mass movements, the politics, the people in Parliament, and the men of violence as well, and bring them on board to create, a rather shaky alliance, but one that really gets things done. We will see as well, and here's for us is very important, a similar alliance being formed after the Easter Rising, in the shape of this new thing called Sinn Féin. And the Sinn Féin movement, and again, we should call Sinn Féin a movement, as it were, not a political party. because Sinn Féin will be, again, one of these umbrella nationalist organisations which is able to have in it, I say, very conservative, moderate, home rule parliamentarians, and on the other extreme is going to have, I say, what we call today terrorists, insurrectionists, people who have no interest in politics at all. And they work together, you'd say, for a while. But of course, what happens? Again, we'll explore this: the Irish Civil War. And the Irish Civil War, and we think about this in a long-term kind of perspective. Of course, they have their short-term causes, all wars, all revolutions, and so on. But is the Irish Civil War fundamentally a reckoning now between the political and the military side of the movement? Is that what the Irish Civil War is? This thing has been, there's always been this uneasy relationship. And we'll talk about some parts during the revolution, how the militarists don't really trust the political side of the movement. The constitutionalists don't like the men of violence, because that's just anarchy, it's chaos. And I say this tension goes on and on and on and on, right throughout Irish history, right up to the present day. And I'll give you a quote here. This is a very telling quote, I think. This is from John Hume, the leader of the SDLP, the leader, as it were, of constitutional nationalism in the North during the Troubles. And here's what he says at a party conference. This is a party conference speech he makes in 1988. So this isn't a private letter or anything. This is for public consumption. And listen to this. This is him attacking now the physical force side of the movement. And I think he really brings together, say, this tension. And let me just show you this quote here. So two of his constituents get murdered in an IRA bomb. And this is, as it were, him now venting his spleen, as it were, against all this. So, they are more Irish than the rest of us, they believe. They are the pure master race of Irish. They are the keepers of the holy grail of the nation. That deep-seated attitude, married to their method, has all the hallmarks of undiluted fascism. They have also the other hallmarks of the fascist, the scapegoat. The Brits are to blame for everything, even their own atrocities. They know better than the rest of us. They know so much better that they take onto themselves the right, without consultation with anyone, to dispense death and destruction. I tell you this, if I were leading a civil rights movement today, I would lead it against the IRA. Wow, that is a really powerful speech. But you can see the point I'm making. He makes, they have no consultation with anyone, so they've got no legitimacy. No one's voting for this. There's a real constitutionalist kind of speaking there. But I say, just bear this in mind now. Both of these sides don't really like one another. They do work together at times, but it's a very uneasy kind of relationship. And I say, those tensions are always going to be beneath the surface. And we can argue, as I say, that the Irish Civil War is essentially the playing out of those. Now, I say, to talk about constitutionalism, I mean, and, to overthrow the Home Rule Party, which is the dominant force in Irish nationalism, since the 1870s, it dominates absolutely everything. And certainly prior to the Easter Rising, you can definitely say that more advanced forms of nationalism were firmly in the minority. Irish nationalists, by the time you get, say, to the Easter Rising or the First World War, are absolutely steeped in the political traditions and cultures of constitutional nationalism. And I mentioned him a moment, Charles Stuart Parnell, ever since Charles Stuart Parnell, who often is called the uncrowned King of Ireland, so dominant as he is, once he'd reinvented this party in the 1870s into the 1880s, he creates now this relentless political machine that is an Irish Home Rule Party. And as he dominates almost all aspects of Irish political life, Irish nationalist political life. Now, Parnell himself, of course, fails in his attempt to win Home Rule. Infamously, he falls to a sex scandal, of all things. Of course, with this lady here, and there are some details about his fall, Kitty O'Shea. So he ends up falling, and what you end up with within the Irish constitutional movement is a huge division is created with people who are pro-Parnell and anti-Parnell. And the pro-Parnell people tend to be, well, we should forgive him this. I mean, it's nothing compared to what politicians do today. These are basically, this is common law wife, essentially. They live together and so on. It's, there's nothing kind of really sordid about this relationship. It's just that the woman has not yet been divorced. And that's the kind of issue. Her husband's well aware of what's kind of happening. But of course, particularly in Catholic Ireland, and certainly it's from within Ireland itself that the anger about Parnell is most vociferous. And I see, so you get a splitting in the movement, and people against Parnell are kind of all, particularly the Catholic Church is against Parnell, very conservative people. They're burning effigies of him and so on in Irish towns, incredibly bitter. Well, others, pro-Parnell people, think we should carry on, with Parnell as our leader. And I say it's very, very bitter, this debate. Certainly some of the men of violence now, which I say Parnell had kind of courted in this so-called new departure, they tend to stay in favour of Parnell. Parnell himself shifts towards a more kind of radical kind of direction and so on. But his fall, and of course his death soon after then. And what happens is it's very odd, this, to show how much damage this has done to the Irish Home Rule movement, is even after he's dead, you still get pro and anti-Parnellite factions who absolutely hate one another. But it's eventually going to be brought back together, this party. And the man the leader of this we'll talk about, particularly who's responsible for this, is John Redmond. He will be someone who manages to bring this party back together. And I say by the time we get to the revolution, this party has a monolithic presence now in Irish nationalist life. And you can see here just how much the party comes to dominate everything. You'll see Ireland in the 1860s. I say it's fairly typical, I suppose, of what you get in Britain. There's liberals and conservatives and a few other people, but I say from the 1870s into the 1880s now, it becomes the dominant voice, with of course a few unionists, and we'll talk about Irish unionism, there hanging on in the northeast. And what comes with the power of this party? I say it's a monolithic thing. All patronage flows from the Home Rule Party. It has and Parnell has started this, its single, as it were, authoritarian leader at the top man, as it were, so the uncrowned King of Ireland, one big figure. And its grassroots now are made up of a myriad of affiliated organisations, most of whom the party forcibly co-opts. And this is one thing about the Home Rule Party. Its ability to move in and to take over any potential other base for nationalist politics in Ireland. So if there's a grassroots movement growing, say, in a Munster county about the land issue or whatever it might be, or maybe more radical than the demand for home rule, if anything, a sporting organisation, a cultural organisation, a local bishop, for example, creating his own, what could be a pseudo-political kind of power base going forward. They move into the executive now, and they end up affiliating it, essentially taking it over to the Home Rule Party. It's incredibly difficult in Ireland for any movement within nationalism, coherent movement to emerge, which is not immediately challenged and taken over. And we'll see this again and again. We'll see it with the Irish Volunteers in 1914, move in and take this whole thing over. I'll give you an example. This is the kind of thing I mean. The All for Ireland League now is created. Again, these are people who, as it were, who are slightly more radical than the Home Rule Party. And it begins again as a grassroots kind of movement, a kind of faction created now, particularly in Munster. And they're now pushing for, as say, more radical ideas. Around the fringes of this are rather violent and kind of confrontational and so on. Again, that movement is taken over. That movement is squashed. And the Home Rule Party, even though we might think of it as sort of moderate and, I say, democratic and so on, it's incredibly authoritarian. I say the rigid discipline of its members and the way the members are controlled. It means the party always kind of remains solid. And as I talk about dissent, and I mentioned John Redmond, here's a wonderful cartoon of John Redmond, as you can see, depicting him as this great authoritarian leader who's putting down faction now. He's going to put it down violently. And Irish politics itself is incredibly violent in our period. Don't think that it's only when you get to Sinn Féin, for example, you start getting violence. No. Whenever I say one of these factions grows, maybe they're standing a by-election against the orthodox, as it were, Home Rule candidate, they'll send in the mobs will go in and there'll be lots of punch-ups and so on. And I think this is what it's saying here. You can see there's Waterford by-election here, and which Redmond ends up winning. It becomes his seat, Waterford. And he's seen as the leader of the mob. So hardly, as it were, the rather austere, maybe conservative, democratic politician we maybe think of when we think about the Home Rule Party. They mercilessly squash any kind of dissent. Another example of this happens in 1909. This is at the infamous Baton Convention, which is this. We have nationalists, as you can see, the All for Ireland League, which will emerge after this, where a new faction stands up saying, where are we going with Home Rule? That tends to be the argument. It's been whatever, 20 years since Parnell died. Where is this movement going? You get the growth of these kind of factions. We've got to do this, this and this. We need to be more proactive. That goes against what the leadership want, and they rouse up the mob now. And it's called the Baton Convention because him and William Smith O'Brien, leader of this faction, and his supporters are literally beaten with batons and sticks and thrown out from the hall. It's incredibly bloody, smashed on the heads with clubs and so on. So it's an incredibly powerful thing. And how do you end up breaking down its monopoly when it is, prepared to use these kind of methods, and is really part of every aspect of Irish life? Well, I think you can say certainly with the Home Rule Party has all these strengths, but there are also some inherent weaknesses which get kind of worse as the years go on, as things develop. They kind of ossify, if you like. One thing is the rigid structure of the party, which has helped it maintain its dominance, means that you get the development of a kind of leadership clique now. And this begins to solidify now over the decades, meaning the elites in charge rarely change. And what they tend to do is pass on their political influence now down to the next generation in their own families. So you pass it now to your son or your nephew. They tend to be all very interrelated. And these family dynasties, as it were, come to dominate all these positions. So, and what you end up getting in Ireland is, in these various counties, so there's an MP, for example, for East Clare or something. And we know the Home Rule Party is going to win. It always wins. It dominates everything. And of course, in the local, he's the big man. These are the big family in these counties. And they're usually quite close to the bishops. They're quite close to the Catholic Church. And they create this kind of power base, a local power base now. And if you really want anything done, you have to be on side with them because they control, all this kind of patronage and so on. So the thing kind of ossifies. And in order to, maintain power, you pass it on to safe hands. So what you don't get, as it were, is a new thinking, a new generation. You don't get a fresh group of politicians with new ideas finding their way into the leadership of the Home Rule Party. That just doesn't happen. So it's increasingly difficult for a new generation to kind of find their way in. And we'll see that with advanced nationalism. There is an element of frustration. You can't get in. The doors are all kind of closed now with these kind of cliques that you get kind of developing. It's also, of course, and again, just mention this, and you can see the character of this party is worth mentioning. One thing is, it does happen, and I say this is because of this rather unhealthy alliance it has with the Catholic Church. Two power bases there, I say in the county, in the local area. It becomes increasingly Catholic. Catholic in terms of its membership, Catholic in terms of its MPs. It had begun, of course, its first leaders were all Protestants. Isaac Butt was a Protestant, then Parnell. Isaac Butt, Roy Foster once called Isaac Butt the John the Baptist to Parnell's Jesus, which is kind of nice. But yeah, these are Protestant notables. Not anymore. Now this is after Parnell, all the leaders now will be Catholic. So, and you can see that change in terms of their background, as it were. So you can see 1874, there's still lots of landed gentry, which tends to suggest they'd be Anglo-Irish, they'd be Protestants in the movement. But now that landed clique now are moving away increasingly from home rule, from Irish nationalism. They're not at home anymore in Irish nationalism, which is more Catholic, as I say. And when we talk about Irish unionism, we'll see that. What you get this polarization takes place, which Protestant equals unionist and Catholic equals nationalist. It happens quite late on this, but when it polarizes, it really polarizes alarmingly. And what you have is this conservatism now of this movement is really mirrored, particularly in the Irish Parliamentary Party itself. Your average Home Rule MP is rather obedient. They'll always vote when they're told to do. They turn up and they're very, very organised and regimented, but they're rather unimaginative. And to the point of ossification, really, as I say, there's no great new ideas coming from your rank and file Home Rule MP. Very little dissent for the leadership policy line. And you can see, as you've got here, this cartoon, as it were, hints at this, the kind of gravy train that you get. And hopefully you can see this. You can imagine now, I've got a nice, safe Home Rule seat now, in my county. Me and my family, we're doing okay. We've got the bishop on side. And yeah, they become little oligarchs, as it were, in their counties, the big man in the local area. And that does, as you can see here, does rankle with a lot of people. And what you end up with the Home Rule parties, despite its kind of size and its domination, seemingly, of nationalist Ireland, the party begins actually to rely on more and more on a very small, increasingly conservative elite. And they're there now to meet, fresh challenges when they arise and so on. There aren't really any challenges, of course. I say after Parnell, they just kind of sit there and year on year you win the election and off you go and carry on the gravy train. The trouble is, as we'll see after something like 1916, the inability of this party now to do this, to meet this new challenge, will prove absolutely fatal. And you realise the party's kind of hollow, as it were, on the inside, even though it looks good. When inside there's no energy. There's no, the ideology itself is just been allowed to, there's no ideological kind of or intellectual fervour, as it were, in this party of new ideas. It just kind of sits there with the same demand, the same policies. And this is fed into particularly by the party's growing this conservatism that you got, because of the constraints that are placed on it by the Liberal Alliance. And this is a very important point. Of course, Parnell himself famously decides to throw in his lot with Gladstone's Liberals to make an alliance. And this is how he hopes this gamble's going to pay off. He's going to hope that in Parliament, with the Liberal bloc of MPs allied with his MPs now, he's going to be able to get through this Home Rule Act. finally. That's the big gamble he takes now. But of course, when it comes to the bit, and the Home Rule Bill is actually presented in 1886, it doesn't work. And you'll see it here as the first Home Rule Bill here. It doesn't work at all. It's a very modest form of Home Rule, as we said, they're actually demanding. But what he's done is now he's fatally hitched Irish nationalism to, as it were, the fate of the Liberal Party by creating this alliance. Of course, he hoped, as I say, it would have paid off, but it doesn't. But now you're kind of stuck with them. So prior to this, what had happened with Irish nationalism, they'd been far more flexible, in the sense they'd stayed outside of British political life. You'll sell your votes to the highest bidder, whoever it is. Give us Home Rule. That's the only thing we want, is Home Rule. And if it's you, Mr. Tory, or you, Mr. Liberal, whoever, I don't care. We'll stay outside and we'll use the power of our seats. Remember, there's a lot of Irish seats. There's 85 or something Irish seats. It's a good block of people there you can use. We'll sell them to whoever. But now they've created this nationalist alliance with the Liberals. And what that does fatally, and this is kind of sad, I suppose, in terms of Irish politics, it means that the Tories almost inevitably now drift to the other major force in Irish political life in the shape of the Unionists. So the Tories, because the Tories, of course, they look at all these Irish seats potentially going to be, Liberal safe seats almost going forward. They need to get some kind of Irish support on their side, and they're going to get, the 25, 26 Unionist seats that are out there. It's not as many, but they feel they need to create some kind of, they need a viable, credible now political ally in Ireland now in this fight. So you get this dreadful kind of polarisation which takes place, I say, not just in Ireland, but in British politics as well now, with both major parties hitching themselves, I say, to these two major political forces in Ireland. And of course, the Irish question itself had done huge amounts to shape the nature of British politics. It's been hugely damaging. And there is Gladstone, of course. Gladstone's decision to support Irish Home Rule had proved absolutely fatal for the Liberal Party, or near fatal for the Liberal Party. What happens is so-called liberal unionists, so these are liberals, but who don't feel good about the idea of Irish Home Rule. And again, when we talk about Irish unionism, we'll talk about why people are so concerned about giving Ireland Home Rule. It seems like a very modest demand, but very, very concerned. And what had happened is a lot of these people, these so-called liberal unionists, had crossed the floor and joined the Tories now. And that's how they'd managed to bring down the Home Rule Bill in 1886. And you actually can date, really, the founding of the modern Conservative Party in Britain from that moment, because now it's, this alliance of, I say, these liberal unionists with these old Tories and so on is really what the Conservative Party ends up becoming. And that manages to, as it were, nullify the Irish nationalist seats that are allied Parnell's Irish nationalist seats. So it splits, causes a huge earthquake, as it were, in British politics too. And we do get another attempt, of course, in Gladstone's very short-lived government between 1893 and 1894. He comes back, tries another Home Rule Bill. So this is after Parnell's dead. Again, that's defeated as well. And what happens is now, in a very unhealthy way, is that the Conservative Party realises the power of the Irish question, that it is a lightning rod. It is an issue now that can unite not just various disparate elements in Parliament. I say you can draw in Liberals now to support it, but across the country as well. It's an issue that really polarises people. I don't know what a similar issue would be, in your country. I don't know your domestic politics. I'm sure there's something, though. I suppose if we look at the United States, you may talk about gun control or abortion or something. These big kind of issues now, which everything goes on, as it were, normally, and everyone's in their silos. But as soon as you mention, as it were, that issue raises its head, immediate polarisation now takes place. And the Tories realise the power of that. And in a very cynical way, and we have to say it is cynical, particularly under the guidance of this man here, as you can see, Winston Churchill's father, is to what they call play the orange card now. They realise now that they can always throw out now this issue of Ireland are defending the Union and thereby defending the Empire and so on, and it works. It gets them votes. People come out. Old tribalism is kind of created, as say. So it's always something they keep in their back pocket. And when we talk about the Ulster Crisis, we'll see exactly this. When the next threat of Home Rule comes along in 1912, that's exactly what the Tories will do. They'll drag this out now, the old spectre of Home Rule. And it does have the desired effect. Immediate polarisation, incredible sort of dangerous situation now develops in Ireland and in Britain as well. So I say it's a very unhealthy thing now, the Irish issue has become in British politics. And I say really because of the failure of Home Rule, of course, it means that for almost 2 decades, the Conservative Party will end up coming to dominate British politics. I say aside from Gladstone's short-lived sort of government, less than a year, 1893 to 4, they are in control for almost 2 decades now, the Conservatives. But, and it's a very important point this, it's wrong to think that during those 2 decades of Conservative-dominated government, that their attitude to Ireland is defensive or passive or even coercive. That isn't the case at all. In fact, the opposite is the case. Because what the Tories actually have is what emerges is a very visionary idea, actually, of meeting Irish grievances, which many of them feel underpin the desire for Home Rule. So the argument goes thus, that most Irish nationalist Irish people, as it were, don't really want Home Rule. They're voting for it out of frustration, because underlying it are real, genuine grievances. And the chief one, of course, we've mentioned is the land issue. Which is a real source of division and so on in Ireland. And the idea is, if you can address those grievances, respect their religion, create a Catholic university, for example, all these things, create infrastructure, invest economically, that support for Home Rule itself will end up disappearing. Again, it's a good argument. You can use that in politics in all kinds of forums in that sense. So what you get, a strange thing is it's the Tories now who try and push forward a radical reform agenda. And what we tend to call this is constructive unionism, or as my preferred phrase would be, killing Home Rule with kindness. Isn't that a wonderful phrase? It's a great way to kind of understand it. And I say they do lots of different things, and you can see some of them here. The fundamental issue, though, is to deal with the land problem. I say the land problem has always been this big issue since after the famine fired this radicalism. Remember, all these new, as it were, lower middle class farmers now, a bit of prosperity, have the vote now. They're the people who are agitating now and joining the Home Rule Party about the land. Of course, it had fired, the so-called land war between 1879 and 1882, which is where they create this Irish National Land League, which agitates on the land, and there's violence, and there's all kinds of protests, and there's refusing to pay rents and so on. This is one of the weapons that Parnell uses in his this new departure, this radical kind of agitation, led by some pretty radical people, including this man here, Michael Davitt. Michael Davitt himself, you can see he's only got one arm. Michael Davitt becomes the leader of the Irish National Land League. He's something of a socialist, actually, Michael Davitt, really. What happens to him, actually, his family are forced, because of the land issue, to emigrate to Britain. He ends up against the Lancashire, where he loses his arm in a mill accident. And then he ends up going to prison for his radicalism, seen as a sort of threat to the British Crown. But in prison, he develops this very strong belief that, which is a kind of socialist belief, I'd say, land must be given to the people that work it. So get all this land out of the hands of the Anglo-Irish elite and all these landowners and give it to Irish farmers, Catholic Irish farmers who actually work the land and give them the rights and so on that should come with it. The 3 Fs and so on, which we kind of mentioned. And you'll see here again another example of this, the threat of the Land League. This is a wonderful way to put it. So, yes, you write those bills now, Mr. Gladstone. You write those Home Rule bills and so on, or there could be trouble. There could be real kind of problems. So, I suppose the fundamental point, as I say, is that this agitation, this land issue has been behind so much anger, so much frustration, so much political opposition. So that if the Tories can move to nullify that now, the hope is that interest in Home Rule will now itself die off. And they introduce a number of land reforms, and one of these is the so-called Wyndham Land Act of 1903. There's lots of different acts, but what it basically means is it's a scheme now developed where the government essentially will end up buying, as it were, the land off these big Anglo-Irish landowners now, and now selling it back to Irish Catholic native farmers now at very affordable repayments. So long-term, very low interest kind of mortgage payments now. And to give you an idea of this, almost half of all Irish land changes hands under these acts, under the Tories, I say from the old Anglo-Irish elites now to the hands of Catholic owners. That's what they're trying to do. And they're incredibly successful. They represent really a kind of social revolution, if you like, on the land in Ireland. And as I said, there's various other things. You can see the Local Government Act, as mentioned, the Catholic University and so on, which you get in the shape of, which is now the National University of Ireland. Big point about this, in terms of our revolution. It means that when the Irish Revolution comes, it's not going to be a social revolution. Again, it's often mistaken for a social revolution. This issue's already been solved. This isn't what people are going to be complaining about. This isn't what people, as it were, who are fighting and Easter Rising and so on are talking about. The revolution, when we get it, this is going to be a nationalist revolution. A revolution about identity, about constitutional symbols. Because the social revolution in Ireland, you see, has already happened. That's the point. Now, there's going to be attempts, of course, to turn the Irish Revolution into a social revolution with people like James Connolly. With the socialist strand, as it were, of the Easter rebels and so on. But we'll see, and when we get to this, we'll see how that is snuffed out very quickly. This is going to be a very conservative, I say, revolution. And ironically, one of the ironies of all of this is Ireland, before the revolution, is by far the most prosperous it's ever been in its history because of these things. So it's not a social revolution. That's a very big point. So the generosity, the hope is the generosity of all this is going to burst the bubble, as it were, of the Home Rule Party. Now, so that's another thing, as it were. And this is a threat, of course, to the Home Rule Party. And I say the fear is, of course, that people are just going to forget about Home Rule. They're going to become more bound up now with broader political movements in Britain. They seem to be getting, this renewed prosperity is coming from Britain in the shape of these kind of acts and so on. The policy is also kind of negative because what it does is kind of reinforce as well the kind of lethargy we've mentioned, which you get, which kind of characterises Irish political life anyway. And this is shown no better than in terms of elections. And I'll give you a kind of remarkable kind of set of figures here. The fact is that most of the seats in Ireland, in all these elections that we get, particularly after Parnell, but even during Parnell's period now, are actually uncontested. There never is actually an election. So when you have a general election in Britain and Ireland together, the vast majority of seats, no one even bothers to stand against the Home Rule Party. Because what's the point? They're going to win anyway. They always win. Only occasionally, I say, do you get, and you can see here the Parnell 1892, you get some sort of semblance of a competition between two wings of the Home Rule movement. Yeah, but most seats. And other seats, again, in the same happens in the northeast, where there's unionists. These unionists, they're all going to win. Everyone knows they're going to win these seats. For example, in Belfast and East Ulster and so on. It's not a problem. So what's the point in contesting them? There's no point. Only in certain places where you get, for example, in Fermanagh and Tyrone and Armagh and Donegal and so on, where there is a potential of the seat changing hands. That's where you tend to get contests, just in some places. So something like 83 of the 103 seats in Ireland are not contested. It's absolutely incredible. It just never happens. So again, you can see how that adds to the lethargy and the ossification, because what happens on the ground is that what's the point of even having a grassroots movement now? What's the point of having a local party that's going to go out and agitate and hand out leaflets or whatever you do? What's the point? And that kind of just withers away. So you end up now with just the oligarchs, the family, the Home Rule Party MPs family. They've got the bishop on side. There's no election. There's no test, as it were, for them. They just keep being returned year on year. That is not a healthy situation. So if you look at the election of 1906, which we'll talk about when we talk about the Liberal landslide and so on, only 21 of Ireland's 103 seats actually have contests. It goes down to 21 seats. And just show you some of the key figures here in terms of this, this party going forward. So Irish politics is very static. It looks good on the surface, but beneath it are all this kind of hollowness, all these cracks and so on. And aside from the odd by-election, it means that these MPs are never replaced. They usually die off, to be honest. They're getting older, more set in their ways. And when they do end up handing, as it were, power, as it were, when they decide to retire, it's their son ends up becoming the next MP or their nephew and so on, all blooded in the same kind of parliamentary tradition. So the big point about all of this is that Irish politics, therefore, is more imagined than real. Now, just one final point to make, and it's a question that may have occurred to you actually, is why is it this Home Rule Party, despite its failure to achieve its avowed aim now of getting a Home Rule Parliament in Dublin, is able to sustain this level of support? And as I say, it doesn't really fray at the edges. Huge amounts of support, which is sustained for decades and decades. It's been a long time they were demanding Home Rule, but it doesn't happen. Now we've talked about some of the reasons, as I said, some of the strengths, as it were, of this party. But I think one big reason is the ability of this party to take credit for all of the positive changes that have happened in Ireland over those decades. So it might say, okay, we haven't got the Parliament yet, it's coming though, but look at how Ireland has transformed. Look at how prosperous it is, and the land has now been transferred. We have a Catholic university now created. We have local government reform. That's because of us. Now, the reality is it isn't really because of them, because as we've said, these initiatives will come from Britain and British political parties. But their argument, I suppose, to be fair to them, would be, if we weren't there, though, in Parliament, constantly pushing, then they would allow Ireland to slip from the agenda. They wouldn't prioritise Ireland at all and Irish grievances. So our very existence as this strong political party means that Ireland has benefited from it. And I think that's one of the key reasons why people keep voting for it, because Ireland is visibly, palpably getting better in this pre-revolutionary period. One very final point to make, and to be absolutely fair to the Home Rule Party, I think the greatest legacy of it is not ideological or philosophical. As we said, there isn't a great deal of that kind of intellectual energy in the party, really. But I think it leaves Ireland with a strong tradition of democratic political engagement. And what we'll see is during the revolution, despite the militarism, the extreme radicalism of some of these ideas, the democratic impulse endures. It lasts. And in many ways, they're the ones who win this revolution. Because the remarkable thing about Ireland in the context of world history is its ability to introduce and sustain a liberal democracy at the first time of asking. That doesn't happen in many countries. You know, if you think of historical examples, think of the Weimar Republic after the First World War in Germany. You know, they try democracy, it fails, then they try again. Maybe it actually works the second time. Maybe it takes another time before it eventually works. But Ireland is able to do it at the first asking. And I think that is absolutely a tribute to the yielding constitutionalism of this Home Rule Party. And I think that, more than anything, is its greatest legacy. Okay, everyone, now next time we're going to move on and talk about advanced nationalism. Which is going to include our militarists and so on. But it's a far more nebulous kind of movement. We're going to look at, I say, the more radical version, more radical separatist Irish nationalism, and its various forms and various organisations which will eventually come together, as we say, and overthrow this Home Rule Party and end up shaping the revolution that we're going to talk about in the course. Okay, everyone, so I'll see you all next time. Take care.